good afternoon, everyone, and welcome Dr. Jeff Vantreese to Conservation Conversation. How are you today?
Doing great, Ann Marie. Thanks so much for having me.
Good, good. Well, for those who may be tuning in for the first time to Conservation Conversations, my name is Ann Marie Sorrell, and I am an elected supervisor for Palm Beach Soil and Water Conservation District. And my goal is to hold various conversations each month around different conservation matters and initiatives that are happening within Palm Beach County and around our state. And so today I'm so honored to have our guest, Dr. Jeff Vantreese, who, Jeff, you and I have met, we met during the election last year, and we served on a panel together, and then you invited me to be on the World Water Day panel a couple months ago. And so thank you for that invite. It was such a great discussion as we were looking at the different legislative matters that were happening in Tallahassee. And I'd love for you to give an update as well on kind of how some of those different bills played out for those who, is that me, who may not be familiar with what was taking place in the legislative session. But before we go into that, Dr. Vantreese, I want to just kind of read your bio a little bit so people know exactly who you are. Dr. Jeff Vantreese is a professor of environmental science and business law at Palm Beach State College and the pre-law magna instructor at Palm Beach Lakes High School in West Palm Beach. Jeff is an experienced civil litigation attorney and scientist who has published extensively in science and law and is a passionate advocate for environmentally sustainable policy and practices. Jeff is a communications chair for the Democratic Environmental Caucus of Florida and is also the chair of the Palm Beach County chapter of the Democratic Environmental Caucus. So again, welcome. First of all, I always like to get to know my guests a little bit better. So let's start with your journey, because you're practicing law, you're an educator, you're a scientist. How did all this come about and come together for you to become this environmental activist, so to speak?
Well, thank you for all that. I went to a small liberal arts college and really gained an appreciation for the interdisciplinary nature of environmental issues. And so we had the policy side, which is kind of why I went to law school, and I have a strong interest in policy and how ideas become policy, which is the legislative end, which is what we were talking about on our panel earlier. Then on the other side, the science, which is something that I think being a scientist is just about curiosity and trying to have doing the best we can within our abilities as people to understand the world, the universe, and how it works. And when you combine those two things, you really have to, because if you think about it, science, policy that not only should it involve science, it absolutely must, because policy that ignores science is always going to lead to bad policy, because it's policy that's uninformed by scientific realities. And so you have to understand the scientific realities on the one hand, right? Because they're true whether you believe them or not, right? Gravity is true whether you believe it or not. Climate change is true whether you believe it or not. You have to understand those realities in order to craft policies that adapt to those realities, because that's ultimately what we have to do as a civilization, as a species. We have to adapt to Mother Nature, because Mother Nature is not going to adapt to us. And so that's sort of where my passion came from when I was in school. And I really understood that I had to learn it from both angles. I had to learn it from the policy side as well as from the science side. So ended up going to law school, got my master's in soil and water science after that from University of Florida. Then I went and got my PhD in ecology with a concentration in soil and water science. So I went to school for a long time, but I think it was really all worth it because I have a very sort of global understanding of all of these issues. So, when I would go to court, I practiced patent and trademark litigation for some time before joining the firm that I'm with now. And there's just so much intersection there to understand when evidence would come in, whether it was scientifically valid or not. And so I think that there's there's a lot there. And oftentimes we sort of have in academics, as I'm sure you know, we have these kind of artificial barriers, if you will, where it's like on the one side you have the humanities, on the other side you have the hard scientists, hard science, math, physics, biology, and so forth. And in fact, those divisions are really man-made. They're not real divisions, right? Because you have to have intersectionality in these areas. And so that kind of brings me to why I became so passionate as an educator. I'm one of the few, I think I'm probably the only faculty at my institution, Palm Beach State, as well as most colleges. I teach in the Department of Environmental Science and in the Legal Studies Department, which is very rare and unusual. But I bring in each of those subject matters into the other, right? So in my legal class, like business law, I bring in environmental law and regulation. In my environmental science classes, I bring in environmental policy. And I think you have to have that global understanding. It's to really be able to effectively communicate these issues to the public.
No, I love that you merge the two, because it's rare that we see both the legal and the science side come together. So I think that that's pretty unique, and one of the things that stood out to me about you when I first met you. So you've been on the front lines and advocating and being a part of just in keeping up with what's happening in our community. And I know you have some topics that you're going to focus in on, but I want to start with probably one of the most recent things that happened in Palm Beach County, particularly with the city of West Palm Beach and the water issue that came up where with the blue-green algae toxins, you couldn't boil the water because it would make the water worse. And so, for a week and a half, the city was, really battling with this issue, and residents were quite confused on what to do. But even more, I had people calling me. I was like, wait a minute, is this your issue?
Yes.
How are you going to fix this? And I'm like, wait a minute.
Right. Yeah, we were on a boil water notice for some time. And I think that, so environmental with politics, sort of in the world of politics, if you will, everything is always short term. And we just see it over and over again. Whether you're talking about someone running for dog catcher or whether somebody's running for president of the United States, there's unfortunately very little political reward for some long-term solution. So you almost never hear somebody was elected because they're going to deliver something great 10 years from now. That just doesn't happen. Everything is very, very short term. And so when we see these sort of long-term problems, we're seeing it with we're finally hearing about infrastructure, which is interrelated to the environment. That's not a separate issue, by the way. Environment and infrastructure are intertwined so deeply. But the long-term consequences of either sustainable or unsustainable policy is something that might take years or even decades for us to notice. But when we notice it, by God, we do, because it affects literally the air we breathe and the water that we drink. And so when we look at something that would lead to a boil water notification, boil water requirement, or would lead to, the blue-green algae outbreak that we had in 2018, and very well could have in the future, it's something that didn't just happen overnight. It happened from years of abusing our environment through excessive pollution, right? Whether we're talking about water pollution in the case of blue-green algae, talking about air pollution and a lot of other contexts, especially the burning out in the Everglades, the sugarcane burning. These are things that the health effects on the citizens and the effects on the environment take years to happen. But once they happen, it becomes very difficult, very expensive to try to remediate or mitigate or reduce that damage. And so we have to consider that the pollution that we see going into our waterways now, I mean, you look at Lake Okeechobee has been so horribly polluted for so many years. And we look at all of the pollution going into the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. The pollution that is going in today could cause problems a few years down the line. The problem is that our policymakers have no political incentive to safeguard against that, because that's beyond their next election. And so politicians are, and that's just the system, even perhaps more so than it is the indictment of the political leaders themselves. The system just favors the very next election cycle. And then when you consider the just takeover of our political process, our political system, with dark money and money coming from these sources. I mean, we talk about it's a tiny fraction of the population that actually is able to contribute significantly to political campaigns. We're really the conversation with the public is limited to the very immediate future, and sort of the long-term effects of these environmental issues just it pretty much just escapes people's minds when they go to the voting booth. And so that's really, I think, what we have to work on here with the conversations that we're having here, such as on this program, and also getting it out to the general public, that we have to think maybe not just in the immediate future, but a few years down the line. So if we look at the algal blooms, what causes it? I think a lot of this goes back to just basic education. And so one of the things that has really gotten under my skin is when I hear about it, is that it looks as though people say, well, this is just too complicated. I just don't understand it. I'm not a scientist, whatever. You don't really have to be a scientist in order to understand some very basic principles. And I think that that's where, even at the elementary school level, you think of the old show, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? Going back to the elementary school level and even the junior high school level, just basic, science, basic, elementary level science, that unfortunately seems to have escaped people. And this has come from a very intentional propaganda campaign to keep people as ignorant as possible on these environmental issues.
So you just said a whole lot to unpack. And I want to go back to a couple of things. One, being a new elected official, I'm not a new person in public service, but being in the elected role, you talked about political figures not having political incentive other than, I gotta prepare for the next election. So most cases, like you said, there's not really a deep dive into the long-term issues. There's not, there's no plan. There's a lot of talking points and messaging, right? And so how do, from your opinion, your stance as a scientist and environmentalist, how do we as political figures become incentivized to look at very long-term efforts and initiatives beyond the next election cycle, whether we're on the ballot or not? So for example, I have a 4-year term. Well, we know that there's only so much that you can fix in 4 years. There are some things, but how do we do a better job as public servants, in your opinion?
I think there's two main components, two main answers to that question. One is education, which starts from pre-K and it lasts throughout the lives of our citizens. We have to always be focused on educating our citizens on these sort of just basic scientific realities, right? So I think that education is critical. The other component, I think, is messaging. We have these just totally false messages that have been that have infested the public discourse. And what really is so maddening is when we have people, on our side, or people that are more conservation-minded people that have accepted these dialogues as if they're written in stone, and they're not. So let me just focus on the education, for a second. So something like the greenhouse effect. When you hear, first it was called, back in the 90s and 2000s, when I was in college in the 2000s, we called it global warming. Then, you would have, they would sort of morphed into calling it climate change, which in many ways is a better term because we're talking about, fluctuations more than just warming, right? Because you'll have a lot of effects, and you'll have accelerating greenhouse effect that comes from removing a lot of the permafrost, and it's more complicated. So we call it climate change instead of global warming. But I think that it gets over people's heads. One of the things I like to just focus on is when we talk to these these people sort of in the middle, right? That are may or may not be voting based on this issue. I like to focus on just the greenhouse effect. Try to, and I would love to see some type of survey of the electorate to figure out, do they really understand what the greenhouse effect is? And this is elementary school level. This is, are you smarter than a fifth grader type of question. This is not a PhD level question, right? Just, do you know what it is? And so, and then if you don't, there should be some type of medium where that can be explained, because it's critical that the public know, what the greenhouse effect is. If you know what the greenhouse effect is, then kind of the rest that comes with climate change will kind of make sense. So I'd like to maybe try an exercise, Ann Marie. I know we're kind of flipping the script a little bit, but how would you, to a basic, let's say, high school graduate level education, how would you explain the greenhouse effect to a layperson?
Wow, you're gonna really put me on the spot. You know what? You got me on the smarter than a fifth grader stump right now. Because, like you said, we've toyed with the word climate change, greenhouse effect, global warming interchangeably. But I would say, the different effects that are the weather's having on, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not going to sit here and say that I know all what you're talking about. That's why we're having this conversation.
At the most basic level, like in terms of communicating it to people, right? So how would we go about doing that? I have some suggestions. I'm kind of one, because
to be honest, I don't know how to basically communicate the greenhouse effect on an elementary level. To be honest.
So I'll take a stab at it. Let me know what you think about this. So I say there are these gases. There's atmosphere consists of many gases, and there's a certain type of gases that trap heat. Other gases don't, some do. The ones that do will cause the global temperature to rise, because when you trap heat, it gets hotter. And that's what they do. That's all they do. It's non-debatable. I think we have to focus on that. It's not debatable. It's not like, debating or trying to argue against the greenhouse effect is like arguing against gravity. It's just, it's nonsensical. So, sort of the next level, right? I mean, we could go into, okay, which gases are they? We know it's CO2, and we could go into, for example, we have methane's a big one. We have these, but the average citizen doesn't even necessarily have to know which gases they are. They know some idea that we're talking about carbon, carbon dioxide and methane and some others, but they really don't need to know exactly how it works. That there's these bonds between the carbon and oxygen and CO2, and you have these sigma bonds that trap heat. They don't necessarily need to know that. They just need to know that they trap heat. And the next level, if we were to say, talking about at a fifth grade level, UV enters, it escapes, it hits the surface of the earth, it's reflected back out as heat. When it's reflected back out, either goes into the atmosphere or gets trapped by greenhouse gases, right? We really don't even have to get there. We just have to say that they trap heat. If people understand that they trap heat, there's really nothing to argue against, right? So I think that on the education level, I think that's critical. I think that, a basic environmental science introductory class should probably be mandated at the high school at all levels, elementary, middle, high, and then probably in college, right? So, one of the classes I teach is Introduction to Environmental Science. That class, I get to teach this to a wide range of majors. I have accounting majors, an English major, all kinds of majors, and then I get to teach the more advanced classes where I'm dealing with all environmental science majors. But it's actually very rewarding to get to teach some of this stuff to people that might not be as familiar with it. And so I think that sort of basic understanding, and we all remember, certain things from our formative years that we were learning in school. We don't remember everything, but if we can just remember that greenhouse gases trap heat, if we can get that, because I don't even know if that basic concept is something that people understand, because it's just too hard.
It's not, Jeff. I'm sitting here telling you, so me not being a scientist, I'm a creative business, that's my wheelhouse, right? Marketing, that's my wheelhouse. So the last time that I recall talking about greenhouse gases, I think I was probably in like the 8th grade or somewhere around there in earth space science, whatever grade level earth space science was taught. Yeah. That is the last time that I remember having that conversation, because I took like biology, so maybe it came up in biology, in some form or sense, but you're right. There's definitely education and re-education that has to happen. I'll even give you an example where a colleague of mine, they did a project down in Miami, and we were trying to show residents the correlation of reducing the carbon footprint and they did a analogy where it was like if you turn your thermostat to set your thermostat to a certain temperature each day, this is how much you can contribute to reducing the carbon footprint in a way. And I'm probably not explaining it properly, right. But they alluded it to 20, they kind of matched it to it equating to 25 gallons of gas.
Yes.
And if someone can think about putting 25 gallons of gas in their car and how much that would cost them per gallon or for the whole 25 gallons, it made it just make more sense to that person, because there were two things they could relate to: a thermostat in their house and the gallons of gas that they put in their car. And so I thought that was, if we could break down the environmental conversation in those very basic terms that people deal with every day in their everyday lives, it could make the education process easier. And then for us as understand, first of all, ourselves, and be able to also correlate it to everyday basic things that we do as people and citizens. It may be just a better way to break these issues down. So I don't know, and you gave some very specific, trap heat. Put heat in something, what happens, right?
Well, I think that basic understanding is necessary, because even when you're talking about, turning your thermostat down, so it's not, because we get our electrical grid we get from coal, which is a major source of sulfur dioxide, which is a major greenhouse gas, also a cause of acid rain. These are things that sort of seem like they're not real, right? So, there was a documentary where they showed somebody living in New Orleans, and that which is an extreme risk of sea level rise, right? And he was in an area on the bayou that he was probably within his lifetime going to lose. It was going to be underwater. And they said, well, and the guy said, well, I have a problem. I can't believe that releasing these greenhouse gases are causing, my house to flood, will cause I just can't put the connection together. And so I think that's where the education is so critical, because you have adults, right, that supposedly have at least gone to high school, that don't understand the connection between releasing greenhouse gases, right, which trap heat, right, that's indisputable, and the fact that it would cause ice to melt, and when ice melts, it will cause flooding, right? It's a pretty basic linear relationship between one thing and another, but even educated people can't see that connection. There's some disconnect between understanding that when you increase heat trapping gases, that will cause ice to melt. Ice melting will cause flooding everywhere in the world, right? And so I think there's that, and I also think that sort of understanding that it's a global issue as well, and requires international cooperation on the policy side. Fortunately, that's something that there's a lot of sort of nationalism sentiment, behind a lot of this, and you see, and the thing is, we can blame politicians, rightfully so, especially from a particular party that denies climate science. But the fact that the electorate, at least a large percentage, not quite 50%, but close to it, is actually they accept that their politicians would say such idiotic things that politicians clearly don't believe themselves, but to say things like, this is the Paris climate, like Ted Cruz, so this is the Paris climate treaty. Why are we doing things for Paris as opposed to the United States of America? I mean, that's just not so nonsensical, right? And that's the type of thing that we have to argue against. And we can't just be talking to the choir, can't just be preaching to the choir. We have to talk to people that are otherwise vulnerable to this anti-science propaganda. And I think that probably one of the only ways of doing that is to get them educated at a young age, where they say, no, this is BS, what these climate science deniers are saying. They couldn't get away with denying gravity, but yet they can get away with denying the implications of the greenhouse effect. And it's the fact that it's even that it's even something that a large percentage of the population has doubts about is a real problem. So I think that we have to get out there and communicate this to people that are not necessarily of our mindset.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that there are ways to do it. I went to over to a city on the west coast of Florida a few weeks ago. They had this graphic. I'm a visual person, so they had this graphic banner in their lobby in the city hall, and it looked at stormwater runoff. And I had never looked at stormwater runoff in the way that this graphic showed it and the impacts. And I said, wow, I don't think people. And so let me explain the graphic to you and to our listening audience. It looked at when the rain comes down on your roof of your house, and everything that's on your roof, that rain washes into now your ground, right? Mm-hmm. And then it looked at from there, the rain is also if you have a driveway, for example, and your car is parked and your car has motor oil that is, whether it's leaking, like leaks, or it's just the fumes from it when you start your car, turn it off, pull in, whatever, that motor oil and those different oils from your car is now in your driveway, and the storm water's running down. And so now everything from your driveway is now also going into your soil as well as your drainage, right? And then you have whatever's in your soil. If you fertilize your grass, the water is now from the rain is now pushing that fertilizer further down into the soil, further down into the drainage, further down into our aquifers, right? And then further out into our lakes and rivers and oceans. And so when they showed this graphic, and I'm sure there was a lot more to it, right? Other little pieces and other things. But for me, it was like, I wonder how many people think about just you putting whatever you're putting in your soil to fertilize your grass, or, how you're parking your car and making sure your car is serviced properly so it's not leaking out oil into your soil and now into your drainage system and now into our water supply.
Well, one thing I would say about that, and that is a good point as far as people that are trying to live sustainably. However, what I would say is that the vast majority of pollution and the vast majority of water use, irrigation and wasting of water actually happens from industry, right? So it happens from, whether it's from, and same thing with pollution, air pollution, right? It comes from factories, it comes from industrial farming. That's where the majority comes from. And so if you look at the science deniers, right? They start with science denial. That is the people that are representing the industry narrative, right? They start with science denial. As the science becomes impossible to deny, which we're kind of, fortunately, knock on wood, getting kind of close to that. That's why we're actually joining the Paris Agreement, right? Which I'll get into in a second. But as it becomes harder to deny the science, then it shifts to, okay, blame the average citizen, blame the consumer, right? Say, well, it's household use. This was something that was done back in the early 1970s with the famous Crying Indian commercial, where there was an actor who was not actually Native American playing a Native American that he was crying, and there was you saw these people dumping pollution all over the roadway, right? And that was, that wasn't totally invalid, that individuals polluting was something that needed to be curbed. But also, it ignored the fact that most of it was coming from industry, not coming from individual people that were taking too long in the shower, or taking, or even fertilizing their lawns. Certainly, people should, and we should have education and policies that encourage household sustainability. But really, the lion's share of our environmental problems come from industry. They come from factories and they come from agriculture. And so, really, it's kind of a way to scapegoat the people by taking that focus off industry, who, again, donates so heavily to our politicians.
No, interesting point. So let me ask you, because, various industries, they have their social responsibility statements, and they have we're giving back to the community, and we're doing this, and we're doing sustainable farming, or we're doing sustainable production in factories. How it's like it's like a their word against the scientists. So how do we find a balance, or is there a way to find a balance between industry, science, and the people?
Sure. So there's a few things that could be done. First is sort of obviously more regulatory oversight. We saw that oversight with the EPA had been gutted in the last administration. We're finally getting a little bit of that back here with Biden. So that's a good thing. So oversight certainly is necessary. But thinking outside the box, you also have to wonder, why are these companies doing this? Why are they behaving in such an irresponsible manner? And of course, they can say whatever they want. It doesn't make it true. If they say that they're behaving sustainably, they might not. They're usually not doing that, right? But what is the obligation that the decision makers at a company owe to, let's say, a large corporation? So you have the board of directors, they appoint officers. You got the CEO, CFO, and so forth. Who do they represent? They represent, legally, shareholders only. That is, they only represent the interests of the shareholders. That is, they are to increase the value of the stock paid to shareholders, and that's it. That's their only goal. That's their only criteria. That's the only reason a corporation exists. It's the only reason it's allowed to exist. And so by expanding the representation or the goals of the corporation to go beyond simply the shareholders, that might be one thing, because that might be one possible solution. It's never been suggested or attempted, but there's other parts of the world where there are other obligations that are owed by officers of a corporation other than simply to make profits for shareholders. And that means what does that mean? We say their only obligation is to increase profits for shareholders. That means that if they can save money by dumping pollution into a river, or by not reducing the amount of pollution that goes into the air, if they can make more money by making the environment more dirty, then they'll do that, right? That would seem unconscionable to us to say, well, they can save money by dumping pollution in the river. Who would do that? They can make more money, they can save money, right? Because it costs money to do things in an environmentally sound manner. It costs money to put scrubbers on smokestacks to reduce the amount of pollution going into the atmosphere. All of that costs money. If they can save money by not doing it, that's what they do. They have an obligation to do that because their only goal is to make money for shareholders. And so perhaps looking at that framework that essentially dictates how everything runs in our economy, maybe that could be revisited. No one's really suggested that. The only suggestion we have that has ever been really put forth is regulatory oversight, and that's it. But nobody's really looked at sort of the structure of the corporation and who they owe a responsibility to. And
that's a good point.
That's something that could be looked at, although unfortunately I just haven't heard it proposed by anybody. But,
yeah, no, that's a good point. Now, what about the companies that says, well, we're creating jobs and we're the economic engine. We know here in Florida, just in the state and in Palm Beach County particularly, our ag community is a huge economic engine for our county and our state. So what happens when that's the argument? Well, we are being responsible. We're creating jobs. We're employing folks. We're feeding families. How does that argument play into this?
That's a great point. I think that to this false narrative that we have of it's either the economy or the environment. It's one or the other, right? So in other words, if we have policies that encourage sustainable practices, then that means that the economy will collapse. Well, of course, that's not true. That hasn't been true anywhere in the world that has implemented climate policy or successful climate policy, such as in Europe and Oceania and other places like that. But what we have to look at that the sustainable practices also create jobs, right? So if we invest in solar, if we invest in wind, these require workers that have to go and build these things. And this is from the bottom of the pay scale all the way to the top, and it would employ a lot of people. That's why what we call the Green New Deal is something that has gotten some traction, because it would actually require that people be put to work in order to make our world more sustainable and make our economy more sustainable. To a certain extent, we actually see some companies doing that on their own, like with electric cars and building electric charging stations and so forth. What we would really need is to have a huge infusion of economic support for that in order to bring us over to electric vehicles and to wind farms and to solar and so forth. And there's a huge, it's pretty complicated, but just kind of a Cliff Notes version. Our energy sector is heavily monopolized, and that monopolization has led to a lack of innovation. One of the things that you can say from the basic tenets of any economic system is you need to have competition, and as things become more and more monopolized, it becomes more difficult. So there's absolutely no reason, no evidence to think that shifting our practices in the energy sector or elsewhere to sustainable practices would ever doom the economy to fail. It would put a lot of people to work. Putting people to work would put money in their pockets that would allow them to spend more money. So it's ultimately just a small handful of people that stand to benefit from keeping us in the dark ages here, using old coal-fired technology and gasoline, and not going to electric or solar, that benefit from that ultimately have a disproportionate say in our political system. So that's where we as citizens have to be able to speak out. But how can we get the citizens to speak out if they're uneducated and they're brainwashed?
Well, that's why I was just gonna chime in for a second. How do, and it just kind of just went off in my head real quick, especially you're being an educator as well. How do we get climate, renewable energy, environmental justice? How do we get this sector, I'm gonna call it a sector for lack of a better word, to become as sexy as technology, right? Mm-hmm. Or cannabis, or cryptocurrency, or whatever, where people, as everyday ordinary citizens, we get excited about the job opportunities, the entrepreneurial opportunities. Like you said, a lot of it's being monopolized. But I don't even think when people think of our environment, when they think about climate change, when they think about resiliency, sustainability, any of those words, right? They're not thinking, oh, I can get a job in this and I can have a career. They're not thinking I can start a business that can create solutions to fix these problems, right? And that's gonna help our environment, or that's gonna help our community, that's gonna uproot the environmental justice issues that have happened. People, I don't believe, just in my sphere of people and influence, have looked at this as an economic driver. We've looked at it from the lens of advocacy, right? But I don't think people are looking at it through the lens of economic development for jobs, housing, education, entrepreneurship, and business ownership. I just don't see that happening. I mean, I may be wrong. What are your thoughts?
I think, again, it just speaks to the unfortunate success of this propaganda machine that's tried to turn the American public against environmental sustainability, right? So it's seen as a burden on the economy. Things are going to cost more if we use sustainable practices, right? Of course, ignoring the enormous costs to our environment and the healthcare costs from air pollution, the effects that it has on people's lungs and on their well-being, their bodies, their cancer that's caused from air and water pollution and so forth. Forget about that. It's just the cost of the technology is so much that you're going to pay more for stuff. Therefore, you should be against it. Not mentioning, of course, that these costs come down over time, and it would put people to work, put money in people's pockets, and so forth. That's left out of the conversation. And so we see a lot of this. It's funded by a really small percentage of the population. I mean, you look at the Koch brothers, for example, that funded a lot of this anti-environmental propaganda that's gone out, and then all you have to do is watch Fox News to see how it's treated. Number one is if there's some legitimate skepticism about climate change, and then secondarily that it's going to cost so much and it would be of such little benefit. And getting back to the education, people buy this. They think, yeah, the climate's always changing. Whatever this technology will have a very small effect. And so all of this misinformation has to be combated in some way. And I think that for those of us that are in the environmental community, there's we do a lot of preaching to the choir, but I think that there has to be some type of mainstream message. Again, there's some success. I mean, look at Biden's multi-trillion-dollar climate plan, and going back into the Paris Accord, this would not happen if not for popular support among people. We can say good things about Biden, but this requires, in order for him to be able to do this from a political standpoint, requires major popular support. So fortunately, there is some support for this, especially with millennials and Gen Z, but there's a lot of work to do because, as the numbers show, there's a large number of people that really believe that this is going to either cost them their jobs or cost them too much money. It's going to be too much of a burden on the economy. There's this false perception that regulation equals economic destruction. If you regulate businesses too much, then then that will kill business, right? We saw that argument with Obamacare. We see that argument continuing on with minimum wage. We see it disproven over and over and over again. All of the threats about these companies being overregulated, they'll just move overseas. All of that has proven to be just empty threats. Quite frankly, that just doesn't happen. It's just the threat. The real threat is to a small number of shareholders that will now not make as much profit because they can't just pollute without any regard for what they're doing, right? I mean, imagine if you or I could just dump our garbage in our neighbor's backyard, right? Imagine if we could do that. We could say, well, we wouldn't have to have the garbage truck come and pick up our garbage every day. We could save money. I'll just dump it in my neighbor's truck. That is so ridiculous on its face that no one would say that. But that's what we're doing at a nationwide level when we're polluting water and air. It's like dumping garbage in your backyard. Nobody has the right to do that. And so I think we have to start looking at it that way. I mean, even talk about education. We always hear the phrase, everything you learn in kindergarten. And one of the things you learn in kindergarten is if you make a mess, you have to clean it up, right? And so, these rules apparently don't seem to apply to billionaires, right? But they have to. They should. I mean, you look at we got 600 billionaires approximately in this country. Right? The high school I teach at, that's about the size of our graduating class. That's a tiny number of people. We just had our graduation yesterday. We had about 600 people that we crammed into the convention center. That's about the number of billionaires that we have in this country. That during the COVID pandemic, got richer by $1.1 trillion. They got when everyone else was suffering, and we were entering this depression level condition that was brought on by the pandemic. Those 600 people got $1 trillion richer, and they want to get even richer. So it's quite remarkable when you think about it. They will pay lobbyists and they'll bribe, it's bribery is what I call it, but they will donate to politicians to such an extent that they want to go from $1 trillion richer to $2 trillion. That's so important to them that they will just wreck our environment for future generations for that. It's just, immoral, evil. It's so I think we have to call it out. We really have to call it out. And some of the some industries might be adapting, but I think we always, no matter what they're doing, even if they're showing some sign of good faith, I think we got to verify everything, and we have to be skeptical of everything that they're doing.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Vantreese, we can talk all afternoon. I do have to wrap up, but sure. I will have you back because we have so much more to talk about. We didn't even get into the updates from the legislative session. We didn't get into infrastructure and what that means for our environment. We didn't get into, some of our local issues. So we do still have a lot to discuss. But what I want to say in this last minute or so that we have, what's a takeaway that you want those who are listening and those who will listen to this later to get, especially when it comes to the science. You know, we've heard through this pandemic, listen to the science, follow the science. Now we're talking about the environment. What do you want to leave with our audience today when it comes to understanding the science in our environment?
That's a great question. And so I think that one of I think probably the most important thing is that your voice matters. And in order for your voice to matter, it really is important that you have at least a basic understanding of these issues. And so while I appreciate it when people say, well, you know, you trust us, you trust the scientists, you trust the policymakers, you listen to the scientists, and that's good enough for you. I think it's really important that people have at least some basic rudimentary understanding of some of these issues. You can just Google it, Wikipedia, and that way you can, when you talk to your families, friends, relatives, so forth, who might be on the fence, you can explain it to them, and they're going to trust you more than they trust, I'm saying you, the listener, more than they would trust me or Ann Marie or one of us, quote unquote, tree huggers. That you can say, no, I've looked this up. This is you know, non-disputable. And I'm starting to see some people come around. I've been talking to some people that you know, were very right of center, that might have been skeptical, that they're like, yeah, this is pretty much settled science at this point. And so that works. And I think that it works. It's not necessarily just from us, but I think it's also from people in the community becoming educated and telling their friends and family, you know, this is what's, you know, really going on. It's not debatable. I think we kind of saw a little bit of in a microcosm with the masks. You know, you had people that were, you know, you had a lot of people, unfortunately, that were just extremely ignorant, that would refuse to wear masks during the height of the pandemic. But it worked to some extent. If some people that they trusted and believed in would say, no, come on, dude, wear a mask. It's just not, it's not right. And I think that's what it is. Just get educated. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to have an advanced degree. Just Google it. You know, learn a couple things about it so that you can effectively communicate it to others that are going to listen to you more than they listen to the rest of us.
Absolutely. Well, we definitely, you know, this platform, and I'm looking to use my platform and my position to really bring education to our community from scientists and experts like yourself, Dr. Vantreese, who, you know, we're all hearing different viewpoints. And I think it's just important for people to get the messaging directly from people who are in the day-to-day. You're educating our students, both on the collegiate and the high school level. And so thank you for all you do. You've been a great advocate in our community, especially in the Democratic Party. So thank you again for what you do statewide as well as in our county. And like I said, we got to bring you back because we still have a lot to cover. So we're going to have a part 2 to this discussion for sure. For everyone who's tuning in, thank you for joining us for Conservation Conversation with myself, Ann Marie Sorrell, Supervisor, Palm Beach Soil and Water Conservation District. Please feel free to go to sorrellsoilandwater.com to sign up for our newsletter, see how you can get involved with the Environmental Roundtable, as well as learn about Palm Beach Soil and Water Conservation District and the things we have going on at pbswcd.org. We will not have a meeting this month because we don't have any new business, but we will be convening in July. So you can get that meeting information on the website as well as in my newsletter if you subscribe to the newsletter. So please share this video as well as get people involved. Let's do our part in conserving. Let's do our part in becoming educated, as Dr. Vantreese said earlier. And let's do our part in just the little things around our house, around our yard, getting involved in advocacy, and then, of course, mentoring our young people and making sure that they're a part of this conversation as well. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you again, Dr. Vantreese, and we'll see you next time on Conservation Conversation.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.